Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next amazing story. And hey, drop some shalawat in the comments to keep our hearts blessed. Now, grab a cozy blanket because tonight, we're traveling back in time. Back to an era where sleep wasn't just a necessity, it was a ritual, a mystery, and sometimes a little weird. Ready? Let's go. The night was silent, well, almost silent. If you could stand in a medieval village after sunset, you wouldn't hear the humming of electricity or the buzz of street lamps. No cars, no sirens, no chatter from late-night cafes. Only the crackle of a dying fire, the rustle of straw beneath, bare feet, and the distant howl of wolves beyond the dark forest. The world was darker than anything you know. The only light came from the moon and stars, which shone so brightly they almost felt alive. There was no city glow to drown them out. No neon signs, no comforting streetlights, just raw, endless night. It was the 14th century, and our story begins with Aldrich, a lone traveler wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, his breath fogging in the cold air, the chill bit at his cheeks as he walked along a muddy road that snaked through the countryside. His boots squelched with every step, and his stomach ached from hunger. Ahead, he spotted a small village, a cluster of wooden houses huddled together, like frightened sheep. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the smell of burning oak. Faint orange light flickered behind shuttered windows, promising warmth. Finally, Aldrich muttered under his breath, a place to rest. But what he didn't know was that he was about to witness something strange: sleeping habits that would seem utterly bizarre to us today, but in his world were as ordinary as breathing. When he reached the largest cottage, Aldrich knocked gently. After a moment, the door creaked open and a woman appeared. Her name was Brida, a farmer's wife. She wore a linen coif on her head and a rough wool dress smeared with flour. Her face was tired but kind. Without hesitation, she welcomed the weary traveler inside. The air in the single-room house was heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and something sharp, maybe boiled cabbage. The only light came from a tallow candle trembling on the table, its wax pooling like white tears. Shadows stretched long and thin across the walls, dancing like silent spirits. As Aldrich's eyes adjusted, he saw something that made him blink twice. An entire family crammed into one bed. Brida, her husband, two small children, and an old grandmother were lying side by side under a thick wool blanket. Their bed was nothing like the feather-soft luxury of modern mattresses. It was a wooden frame stuffed with straw, scratchy and lumpy, covered with coarse linen sheets. And yet, this was normal. In the Middle Ages, space was precious and heat was life. Winters were brutal, and heating an entire house was impossible. The only way to survive the cold was to share body warmth. Privacy? That was a luxury for kings, not for common folk. Brida gestured for Aldrich to sit by the fire, and he gratefully sank onto a wooden stool. He watched the family whispering softly before they settled again. Soon, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic breathing of those in bed. Aldrich thought they would sleep until dawn, but he was wrong. A few hours later, he stirred awake to the sound of movement. The bed creaked as Brida sat up and stoked the fire. Her husband reached for a small prayer book and began murmuring Latin verses. The children whispered and giggled, their bare feet padding across the floor. Even the old grandmother was awake, humming softly as she spun wool by candlelight. Aldrich blinked, confused. It was still the dead of night. Why was everyone up? Brida noticed his puzzled expression and smiled. This is the waking time, stranger. Between the first and second sleep, You see, in medieval Europe, people didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do today. They practiced segmented sleep, also known as biphasic sleep. They went to bed shortly after sunset, slept for 3 to 4 hours. This was the first sleep then. Woke up for an hour or two before returning to bed for the second sleep until dawn. During this midnight interval, people did all sorts of things, prayed, read, tended the fire, even visited neighbors. Some used the time for quiet reflection. Others, well, let's just say this was a favored time for intimacy between married couples. The church even encouraged it, calling it a holy hour for conceiving children. Aldrich rubbed his eyes as he watched Brida's husband recite prayers, while grandmother muttered charms to keep away spirits. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with small wooden toys in the flickering candlelight. It was eerie, yet strangely serene, like a secret world that existed only. When the moon was high outside, darkness pressed against the shuttered windows, thick and unbroken. Without lanterns or lamps, the night was an ocean of black. People feared it. They believed demons roamed after midnight, hunting for wandering souls. To ward them off, they carved crosses into walls and hung charms above their beds. Brida showed Aldrich a small pouch tied to the bedpost. Inside were dried herbs. Keeps the night hags away, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Aldrich didn't dare ask what a night hag was. When the fire burned low and yawns began to spread, the family climbed back into bed for the second sleep. They made space for Aldrich at the very edge of the straw mattress. He lay down, feeling the sharp stalks poke through the rough sheet. Something crawled on his arm, probably a flea. Pillows? Forget it. He rested his head on a rolled-up cloak. The blanket smelled of smoke and sweat, but it was warm, and warmth was everything. As he closed his eyes, he listened to the crackle of embers and the slow, steady breathing around him. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and far away, a church bell tolled midnight. Before sleep claimed him, Brida whispered softly, "May the second sleep bring you good dreams, traveler." And with that, Aldrich drifted into a slumber deeper than any he had known before, as the medieval night wrapped him in its dark, mysterious arms. The fire had burned low, leaving only red embers that glowed like watchful eyes in the dark. Aldrich lay still on the edge of the straw mattress, the coarse wool blanket pulled tightly over his shoulders. Around him, Brida's family moved softly, their voices no louder than whispers. It was the middle of the night, yet the room was alive. He had expected deep slumber until dawn, but instead, the family had risen as if morning had already come. It was strange, unsettling, and oddly fascinating all at once. Aldrich opened his eyes wider, blinking at the dim glow of a tallow candle on the rough wooden table. Brida knelt by the hearth, coaxing life back into the fire with gentle breaths and careful hands. The flames licked upward, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits across the walls. Hrolfger, her husband, sat at the edge of the bed with a small book in his hands. The pages were yellowed and worn, the words barely visible in the flickering light, yet his voice carried the solemn cadence of prayer. His murmurs mingled with the quiet hum of the old grandmother, who spun wool in the corner, her gnarled fingers working the spindle with practiced ease. Aldrich cleared his throat softly, unsure if he should speak. "Is this normal?" he asked. At last, his voice hesitant in the hush of the room. Brida turned her head and smiled, her face softened by the glow of the fire. "Aye, traveler," she said. "This is the waking our God gives us this time for prayer. And other things, Aldrich thought. But he did not ask. Instead, he sat up slowly, feeling the cold bite at his face as the blanket slipped from his shoulders. He listened in silence as the family moved about, their actions calm and deliberate. It felt like stepping into a hidden world, one that lived only in the deepest hours of night. The forgotten rhythm of sleep what Aldrich witnessed was no oddity. In the Middle Ages, sleep was not one unbroken stretch as we know it today. It was divided into two parts, the first sleep and the second sleep, separated by a period of wakefulness that lasted an hour or more. People went to bed shortly after sunset, slept for 3 or 4 hours, then rose quietly to tend the fire, pray, talk, or even visit neighbors. When the interval ended, they returned to bed for the second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This pattern, called segmented or biphasic sleep, was as ordinary to them as the ticking of a clock is to us. The church called this waking time a holy gift. Monks rose from their hard pallets to chant psalms in cold, echoing halls. In villages like this one, peasants knelt by the hearth to whisper prayers or recite charms to ward off evil spirits. But not everyone spent the hour in devotion. For some, it was a time of whispered secrets, quiet conversations, and tender embraces. A house alive at midnight Brida handed Aldrich a small wooden cup of ale, warm and slightly sour. It soothed his throat, though its sharpness made his lips pucker. "Drink," she said kindly. "The night is long." The room smelled of smoke, damp earth, and the faint musk of animals. In the corner, a hen clucked softly, pecking at crumbs. Scattered on the dirt floor, 2 pigs dozed near the door, their snouts twitching in dreams. Aldrich watched as Brida fed the birds and returned to her spinning, the spindle twirling lazily between her fingers. She moved with ease, her hands guided by habit, as if this strange midnight ritual was carved into her bones. "You work even now?" Aldrich asked, his curiosity breaking the silence. Brida shrugged without looking up. "There's no better time. The house is quiet. The children play. The fire burns warm. And the spirits." Her voice dropped lower, her eyes flicking toward the shuttered window. "The spirits keep their distance if our hands stay busy." Aldrich felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had heard such whispers before of night hags and wandering souls, of things that pressed upon sleepers and stole their breath. In a world where darkness was absolute, superstition thrived like ivy on a stone wall. To sleep was to surrender, and surrender was dangerous. So they guarded themselves with prayers, charms, and the simple defense of wakefulness, the village in shadow restless. Aldrich rose and pulled his cloak tight around him. The door groaned softly as he slipped outside into the bitter cold. The night struck him like a blade sharp and merciless. Frost clung to the earth, crunching beneath his boots as he walked. The air was so clear it seemed to cut through his lungs, and above him, the stars burned like silver fire, countless and unblinking. The moon hung low, washing the world in a pale, haunted glow. The village lay silent, but not entirely asleep. Here and there, faint glimmers of light leaked through cracks in shutters. Flickering like distant fireflies, Aldrich realized Brida's family was not alone. Others were awake too, tending fires, murmuring prayers, or sharing quiet words. In one cottage, he heard the muffled sound of laughter, soft, careful, but unmistakable. Lovers, perhaps stealing moments in the darkness. Further down, a shadow flitted across the path, clutching something close, a thief, a messenger. In this secret hour, who could tell? The stillness was heavy with secrets. Aldrich felt it pressing on him like the weight of deep water. This was no ordinary night, it was a threshold. A door between two worlds, the waking and the dreaming, the sacred and the forbidden. Holy and unholy things when Aldrich returned to the cottage. The air inside was warmer, softer. The children dozed. Near the hearth, their little bodies curled like kittens. Hrolfgar closed his book and looked at Aldrich with calm, steady eyes. "Have you prayed, stranger?" he asked. Aldrich hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I have prayed enough for one night." Hrolfgar nodded, his expression unreadable, then turned to Brida. Something passed between them, a glance, a softness that spoke of long years shared in hardship. Aldrich understood then what Brida had meant earlier. This hour was not only for prayer and chores. It was also the hour of intimacy, the quiet space where desire could bloom like a hidden flower in the dark. The church approved, even encouraged it, calling it a godly time for conceiving children. For many couples, it was the only privacy they would ever know. Aldrich turned his gaze to the fire, granting them what courtesy he could. Shadows writhed across the walls like black ribbons, bending and twisting as the flames breathed low. The smell of tallow and smoke hung heavy, mingling with the earthy scent of wool and sweat. Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters like a restless spirit. Whispers in the dark, all used the waking hour so innocently. Aldrich remembered the rumors, stories carried from village to village, whispered over mugs of ale. Some spoke of lovers slipping through frozen fields to meet in barns or byways, risking death for a taste of forbidden sweetness. Others told of thieves prowling the roads, knowing few would be awake to see their crimes. And then there were darker tales still of midwives who muttered charms over newborns, of women gathering under moonlight to call upon powers older than the saints. Witches, they called them, whether truth or fancy. Who could say? In a world ruled by fear and faith, belief was a seed that needed little soil. The second descent into sleep at last, Brida rose and drew her children close, tucking them under the rough woolen blanket. Hrolfgar snuffed out the candle, plunging the room into darkness thick as ink. The only light came from the embers, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of some sleeping beast. One by one, they climbed back into bed, their bodies fitting together, in a tangle of warmth and breath. Aldrich lay down at the edge, the straw crackling beneath him. His mind hummed with questions, but weariness pressed harder still. The sounds of the waking hour faded, the soft hum of prayers, the hiss of the fire-round silence flowed back into the room, deep and heavy. Outside, a wolf howled, its cries stretching thin and lonely across the frozen fields. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled, slow and solemn, marking a time that belonged to no one and everyone. Aldrich closed his eyes and let go. The second sleep took him like a tide, drawing him down into darkness without dreams, into the secret heart of the medieval night. The second sleep ended when the first pale threads of dawn slipped through the cracks of the wooden shutters. A rooster crowed somewhere in the yard, its cry slicing through the quiet like a blade. Aldrich stirred on the edge of the straw mattress, his body stiff, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar hardness beneath him. As his eyes opened, the dim glow of morning revealed the truth he had only half noticed in the flickering firelight. The night before, the bed was a crowded, tangled nest of limbs, blankets, and breath. Brida lay pressed against her husband, her hair loose and damp with the sweat of sleep. Beyond her, the two children snuggled close, their small faces soft in dreams. At the far side, the old grandmother muttered faintly in her slumber, her toothless mouth opening and closing like a fish drawn from water. And then there was Aldrich, curled awkwardly against the rough wooden frame, his boots still on because there had been nowhere to put them. It was stifling, this closeness. And yet it was not without a strange comfort. There was warmth in the shared breath, a certain rhythm in the way their bodies rose and fell together with the tide of sleep. It felt almost like being folded into a single living thing, a creature built of flesh and fatigue, bound not by blood alone, but by necessity. Why? They slept so closely in the Middle Ages, space was a luxury few could afford. The typical peasant home was a single room where life unfolded in layers, cooking, eating, working, and sleeping all happened in the same cramped square of earth and timber. Separate bedrooms were the privilege of lords and ladies, and even they often shared their chambers with servants or guards. For common folk, one bed, sometimes little more than a frame, stuffed with straw, had to hold an entire family. But warmth was only part of the reason. Beds were expensive, their frames hewn from oak or ash, their mattresses filled with straw, reeds, or if fortune smiled, feathers. A blanket could cost as much as a month's wages. To own more than one bed was to declare wealth few ever dreamed of. So families shared, night after night, bodies packed tight against the cold like logs in a fire. Aldrich had heard of this custom before, but hearing and living were different things. Last night, the reality had pressed against his skin with the heat of breath and the scratch of wool, with the sharp scent of sweat and the faint musk of animals. He had felt the grandmother's elbow dig into his side, had shifted carefully to avoid crushing the little boy's arm. And now, in the light of dawn, he understood how natural it seemed to them, how strange it was only to him. Strangers in the same bed. Brita stirred and blinked at him with heavy eyes. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice thick with drowsiness. "As well as a man can when he sleeps among angels," Aldrich said with a crooked smile. She laughed softly and pushed herself upright, pulling the blanket over her nightshift. "You're not the first traveler to share our bed," she said, "nor will you be the last." Her words startled him at first, though he quickly realized their meaning. In this world, where inns were few and roads dangerous, hospitality was a sacred duty. A wanderer who sought shelter might share not only a roof, but a bed with his hosts. Sometimes that meant lying shoulder to shoulder with men he barely knew. Sometimes, as in noble households, it meant sleeping in the same chamber as servants or guards. The idea of solitude in sleep, the notion of a bed all to oneself, was a dream for kings. Yet this closeness was not without consequence. Secrets thrived in such shadows. Aldrich recalled stories of travelers who vanished without trace, robbed in their slumber by those who smiled by day, and others whispers of temptations born of warmth and proximity, of glances exchanged in darkness, when vows lay far behind and the fire burned low. In a world where privacy was a ghost, virtue walked a narrow path. Beds of lords and peasants. Later that day, as Aldrich wandered through the village, he found his thoughts circling back to the bed he had left behind. It was a crude thing. 4 posts, a frame of rope lashed tight, a mattress of straw that crackled under every shift of weight. Yet to Brita and her family, it was treasure. He wondered what a nobleman's bed might look like, those he had glimpsed in castles on distant roads. Great carved things, their posts wound with silk, their mattresses plump with feathers, their sheets fine as a maiden's hair. Curtains of velvet drawn close against the draught, a brazier glowing in the corner. And yet, even in those gilded chambers, sleep was rarely solitary. Pages dozed by the hearth, maids curled on pallets, guards leaned against the door with swords across their knees. Privacy was the privilege of no one in this age, not truly. The sounds of shared sleep that night, Aldrich found himself once more in Brita's cottage. For the road was long, and the next village farther than he could reach. Before dark, again, he shared their bed, and again, he surrendered to the press of bodies, the mingled breath, the smell of wool and smoke and flesh. At first, he lay awake, listening to the rasp of the grandmother's breath, thin and wheezing like wind through dry reeds, to the soft whimper of the child dreaming beside him, to Brita's sigh as she shifted, the rustle of linen, the faint creak of the bed as it bore their weight. It was a symphony of small sounds, intimate and unguarded, the music of a world without walls. And as he lay there, he thought of his own childhood in a far-off town, of a narrow bed shared with two brothers under a leaky roof, of nights when frost rimed the inside of the shutters, and they huddled close for warmth. He thought of how easily comfort can wear the mask of inconvenience, how quickly a burden becomes a bond. In the darkness, pressed among strangers, Aldrich felt the old ache of loneliness ease. Just a little. The risks of closeness, but such closeness carried dangers beyond temptation. Sickness spread like fire in these tight quarters. A cough could cut through a household in a night. Fever could take a village in a week. And when plague walked the land silent, invisible beds became graves before the dawn. Perhaps that was why they whispered charms and clung to holy words, why they hung sprigs of herbs above their doors, and prayed to saints whose names had been worn smooth with centuries of pleading. Aldrich knew these risks well. He had seen death, crouched at the hearth of many a cottage, had smelled the sour breath of pestilence in towns where even the rats lay still. Yet here, in the hush of midnight, with the fire painting the walls in soft amber, he could almost forget. Almost morning, light when dawn came again. Ryder rose and opened the shutters, letting in a blade of pale gold that sliced the shadows in two. The frost on the ground outside glittered like a field of glass. The children tumbled from the bed, laughing, their bare feet slapping the cold floor. Hurlsker stretched with a groan and reached for his boots. The grandmother still slept, her thin chest rising and falling like the last breath of winter. Aldrich stood and drew on his cloak, his mind full of thoughts he could not quite name. He had walked the roads of many lands, had seen kings in their halls and beggars in their filth, but never had he felt so keenly the fragile thread that bound all men together. The need for warmth, for shelter, for the comfort of another body in the dark. He thanked Brida with a low bow and stepped out into the cold. Behind him, the door closed, and the smoke from the chimney curled into the sky like a prayer. Asterisk, the road stretched long and gray beneath the winter sky as Aldrich left Brida's village behind. Frost clung to the earth like a shroud, crunching under his boots with every step. His thoughts wandered, circling back to the crowded bed where he had spent two nights. He could still feel the scratch of straw through the thin sheet, the stiffness in his limbs, the faint ache in his back that no amount of stretching could banish. Comfort, he realized, was a word unknown to most in this age. Survival was enough. But as he walked, he wondered how did people truly rest on such crude things? And what secrets hid beneath those humble blankets? He found his answers soon enough. That evening, he reached another village, smaller than Brida's and bleaker by far. Smoke curled thin from crooked chimneys, and the cottages huddled close, together as if for warmth. Aldrich knocked at the door of the largest house and was greeted by a man whose beard was thick with frost. The man's name was Osric, and he welcomed the traveler without question, for such was the law of kindness on lonely roads. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of peat smoke and boiled turnips. A single candle burned on the table, its feeble glow battling the shadows that clung like cobwebs to the rafters. When Aldrich's eyes adjusted, he saw the bed door, what passed for one. It was little more than a frame of rough timber lashed together, with rope. The ropes sagged in the middle, forming a hollow that swallowed any who lay upon it. Over this hung a sack stuffed with straw. It seemed straining against the weight. A sheet of coarse linen covered the whole, its surface rough enough to scrape the skin. At the foot lay a blanket, so heavy it seemed woven of stone, its wool thick with grease and years of use. On the floor, a dog slept curled in a patch of warmth, its ribs showing through its fur. Osric saw Aldrich studying the bed and grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. A fine resting place, better than the ground, and softer than a plank. Aldrich forced a smile and nodded, though in truth he had slept on battlefields with more comfort. He dropped his pack and lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. The straw crackled beneath him, sharp stalks poking through the linen like the points of hidden spears. He shifted, and the ropes groaned like an old man's bones. Dust rose in a thin cloud, filling his nose with the dry, bitter scent of chaff. He sneezed, and Osric laughed. As night deepened, the family gathered for sleep. There were 5 of them: Osric, his wife, 2 boys, and a girl no older than 7. They shed their rough tunics and slipped into long shifts of linen, worn thin, and patched with care. One by one, they climbed into the bed, their bodies pressing close in the dim warmth. Aldrich was given a space near the edge, his cloak for a pillow, and his boots tucked beneath the frame to keep them from freezing. He lay down with a sigh, feeling the straw shift beneath him like restless worms. Every movement brought a fresh jab of stalks against his ribs, a whisper of chaff against his skin. The blanket was drawn over them, heavy and damp with the smell of lanolin. It settled on Aldrich like a slab of stone, pinning him in place. Beneath it, the air grew thick with the heat of bodies, with the sour scent of sweat and smoke and earth. He breathed shallowly, his mind drifting to the soft feather beds of noble halls he had glimpsed through open doors, their sheets white as snow, their pillows plump as clouds. Such things belonged to another world, a world he had never truly touched. Here, comfort was a word spoken in jest, and warmth was a prize won through nearness, and weight. Sleep came slowly, broken by the creak of ropes and the murmurs of dreams. Aldrich woke more than once in the dark, his back aching, his limbs numb from the press of bodies. At one point, the little girl rolled against him, her small hand curling around his arm like a vine. He lay still, listening to the music of the house, the rasp of Osric's breath, deep and harsh, the soft hum of the mother's snore, the whisper of wind clawing at the shutters. Beneath it all, the faint rustle of straw, alive with the tiny movements of unseen things. Fleas, perhaps lice, more likely. He felt an itch creep along his neck and resisted the urge to scratch. In the gray hour before dawn, Aldrich rose quietly and stepped outside into the brittle cold. The sky was a sheet of iron, streaked with the first pale threads of morning. He drew in a lungful of sharp air, washing the taste of smoke from his mouth. Behind him, the cottage crouched like a beast in slumber, its breath curling from the chimney in thin white plumes. He thought of the bed inside, of the weight of the blanket and the bite of the straw, and wondered how many lives had begun and ended in such narrow spaces. How many births, how many deaths, how many dreams had tangled in those ropes, soaked into those coarse sheets. Later, as he shared a bowl of thin porridge with the family, Aldrich asked Osric if all beds were like his. The man chuckled, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. Unless you've silver to spare, then you might have feathers under your bones, or a sheet smooth as a maiden's cheek. But for folk like us, straw will do. Change it when it sours, beat out the vermin when they bite too hard, and thank God for what you have. He handed Aldrich a crust of bread, hard as stone, but warm from the hearth. Better a bed of straw than the cold ground. Aldrich nodded, though in his heart he longed for a space of his own, for a pillow that did not smell of damp wool and the sweat of strangers. Yet even as he dreamed of softer things, he knew this truth. The bed he scorned was a treasure to those who shared it. In a world where winter could strip a man to bone, where hunger prowled like a wolf at the door, warmth was worth more than silk, and the weight of a blanket could feel like grace. That night, when the darkness fell once more, Aldrich found himself in another bed, in another cottage. And the story was much the same. The ropes creaked, the straw stabbed, the blanket crushed him like a stone. Yet as he lay there, listening to the hush of breath around him, he felt a strange sense of belonging. In the end, what was comfort but the presence of others? The certainty that when the wolves howled beyond the fields and the wind clawed at the door, there were bodies pressed close, sharing heat, sharing life. He closed his eyes, the roughness of the linen against his cheek, and let the second sleep take him, carrying him down into a darkness deeper than the night. Asterisk night had fallen like a shroud of ink across the land. Aldrich walked the narrow road alone, his cloak pulled tight against the wind that whispered through the bare branches of the trees. The last light of day had died hours ago, and now the world was nothing but shadows and silence. The moon hid behind a veil of clouds, and the stars flickered like dying embers, faint and cold. Ahead lay the promise of a cottage, a roof, and a bed, yet the darkness between was thick with whispers, and Aldrich felt every one of them press against his skin. It was not the cold that troubled him, nor was it hunger, though his stomach had been empty since noon. It was something older, deeper, the sense that he was not alone, that in the blackness beyond the road something watched. Every rustle of dry leaves, every snap of a twig seemed to breathe that truth. His hand fell to the hilt of his dagger, and though his mind told him it was folly, his heart beat faster all the same. He was a man of the road, hardened by years of wandering, yet even he was not immune to the spell of the medieval night. When at last he saw the glow of firelight seeping from a shuttered window, relief washed over him like warm wine. He quickened his pace, boots crunching on the frozen earth, and soon he stood before a low-roofed cottage crouched against the wind. He knocked, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman with a face carved by years, her eyes dark as wells. She studied him in silence, then stepped aside without a word, gesturing him in. The room beyond was small, its air thick with smoke and the smell of boiling cabbage. A single fire burned low in the hearth, its flames painting the walls in restless, orange shadows. In the corner, a man sat sharpening a sickle, the rasp of steel against stone filling the hush. Two children huddled beneath a blanket on the floor, their wide eyes gleaming in the dim light. Aldrich offered a greeting and a smile, but neither the man nor the woman returned it. Instead, the woman barred the door and crossed herself, her lips moving in a whisper he could not hear. It was only when Aldrich lowered himself to the bench by the hearth that he noticed the marks, charred lines etched into the wood of the door, blackened crosses smeared with soot. Above the hearth hung a sprig of something green, though winter had stripped the world bare. He stared, and the woman saw his gaze. "For the spirits," she said at last, her voice low and rough. "They walk on nights like this," Aldrich said. Nothing, but his heart gave a slow, uneasy beat. He knew the tales they were as common as the air itself. Spirits that pressed on the chest of sleepers and stole their breath. Demons that slithered through keyholes to whisper blasphemies in the ears of men. Witches who flew on the wind, their laughter sharp as knives. Such things were not to be mocked, not here, not now. When the darkness pressed close and the wind howled like a wolf at the door, the woman stirred the pot that hung above the fire, her hands trembling slightly. "Keep the blanket over your face when you sleep," she said without looking at him. "They come when you dream." Aldrich almost laughed, but the sound withered in his throat, for in truth, he remembered the stories of his own childhood of the nightmare. That cruel spirit who sat on a sleeper's chest until breath fled and death crept near. Of the hag that crawled from the shadows to braid the hair of horses, leaving them foaming and wild by dawn. He remembered the old prayers whispered by his mother. The charms tucked under pillows, the iron nails driven into door frames to bar the way of evil things. He had not believed them for years. And yet, belief has a way of returning when the world goes dark. The family ate in silence, each spoonful of thin cabbage broth echoing in the stillness. When the bowls were empty, the man set his sickle by the bed, its blade gleaming like a crescent moon in the firelight. "Steel keeps them out," he muttered, his voice like gravel. Then he stretched out on the floor beside his children, pulling the blanket tight. The woman doused the candle, leaving only the faint glow of the dying fire. Aldrich lay on a pallet near the hearth, the rough wool of the blanket scratchy against his skin. The room was steeped in shadow now, the kind of blackness that seemed to breathe. He closed his eyes, but sleep came slowly, tangled in the threads of old fears. Somewhere outside, the wind rose, keening through the trees like a voice lost in grief. The fire sputtered, and for a moment, the walls seemed to twitch, their shadows writhing like living things. He told himself it was nothing, only smoke, only wine, but his heart would not listen. Time crept like a thief. At last, Aldrich drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. But if he dreamed, he did not remember, for he woke with a start to the sound of whispering. His eyes flew open, and for a moment, he thought he saw something crouched by the hearth, a shape darker than the dark, hunched and still. He blinked, and it was gone. Only the fire remained, its embers glowing like the eyes of a patient beast. He lay back slowly, telling himself it was a trick of the night. But he pulled the blanket over his face all the same. When morning came, pale and cold, the cottage stirred to life. The woman fed the fire, her face drawn and gray. The man took up his sickle without a word and stepped into the bitter light. The children clung to her skirts, their eyes hollow with a fear too old for their years. Aldrich thanked her and left, but as he walked away, he glanced back once. The sprig above the door trembled in the wind, and the blackened crosses glared like scars against the wood. On the road again, Aldrich thought of the night and the shadows, of the whisper that might have been a dream or might not. He thought of how darkness bred its own truths, how fear grew in the spaces where light could not reach, and he understood, then, why the people clung to their charms, their prayers, their iron and fire, in a world where death lurked in every fever, where hunger gnawed like a rat at the belly. What else could they do but believe? Faith was their armor, fear their shadow, and the night belonged to both Dot as the sun rose higher. Burning the frost from the fields, Aldrich let out a slow breath. The weight of the dark was gone, yet its echo lingered, a whisper at the edge of thought. He walked on, the road stretching before him like a ribbon of pale bone, and wondered what other secrets the night still held. Asters, the village, was already sinking into shadow when Aldrich arrived. The sun had fled beyond the hills, leaving a thin smear of crimson on the edge of the sky, like blood spilled upon steel. As he walked through the narrow lane, the cottages loomed like crouching beasts, their thatched backs hunched against the wind. From a few chimneys, smoke rose in pale threads, carrying the faint scent of peat and burning wood. Doors closed one by one as the last bells tolled from the distant church tower, a slow, mournful sound that seemed to weigh upon the very air. That was the curfew bell in these lands. When its voice rolled across the fields, it was a warning, as much as a call. Cover your fires. Bar your doors. Let no light escape into the hungry dark. Aldrich knew the words root scouvrefoy. Cover fire, and though some claimed it was no longer enforced, the habit clung like ivy to stone. Even in towns, shutters slammed tight at the sound, for to leave a flame unchecked was to risk ruin. A single spark could turn a street to ash. And beyond that fear was another, older still, The dread of what walked when men slept and the world lay blind. Aldrich found lodging in the only tavern the village offered, a low, timbered hall that crouched like a sullen hound at the road's bend. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of ale, sweat, and damp wool. A few men hunched over their cups by the hearth, their faces carved from shadow and firelight. They spoke little, their voices low and heavy with the weight of the air above them. The rafters dripped with darkness, and in that gloom, the single candle on each table was a fragile island, its flame guttering with every draught. The tavern keeper was a barrel of a man with a face as red as autumn apples. He gave Aldrich a curt nod and set a tankard before him. "You're late on the road," he grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Best not make a habit of it. Night's no friend to travelers." Aldrich smiled faintly and took a swallow of ale, bitter and warm. "So I've heard," he said, but the man only grunted again and lumbered away, leaving Aldrich to the murmurs that stirred like ghosts in the corners of the room. He heard the words half-formed, half-swallowed, about shadows in the fields, about voices in the hedgerows, about lights that danced where no hearth should burn, tales, perhaps, or warnings. In this world, the line between the two was thin as a spider's thread. When the last bell tolled again, deeper and more distant, the tavern began to empty. One by one, the men rose, throwing their cloaks about their shoulders, their boots striking hollow against the floor. The door opened and closed in slow rhythm, letting in a breath of night with every swing, cold, sharp, and smelling faintly of frost and something else, something Aldrich could not name. When at last the door was barred and the hearth banked low, he was led to a small chamber above the hall. Asterisk, it was a narrow space, its ceiling sloping like the back of a bow. The bed was a rough frame of wood with a sack of straw for a mattress, a single coarse blanket folded upon it. In the corner stood a candlestick with a stub of tallow candle, its sides ridged like the bark of a tree from nights of guttering flame. Aldrich lit it with a spark from the hearth below, and the room leapt into a trembling half-light, the shadows crouching back like beasts driven from their prey. He shut the door and slid the bolt, then sat upon the bed, listening. The silence was vast. It pressed against the walls, thick and smothering, broken only by the whisper of the wind beyond the shutter and the faint crackle of the candle's wick. The flame shivered, casting long fingers of darkness that writhed across the beams like black serpents. Aldrich stared at it, feeling the old unease creep through his bones. In this age, light was not a thing taken for granted. A single candle was treasure, a guard against the dark, a sentinel that held the void at bay. Without it, the night would swallow the room whole, and who knew what else might come with it. He thought of the stories told on roadsides and by fires, of the things that crept through cracks and keyholes, of demons that fed on sleepers' breath. He remembered the marks burned above cottage doors, the sprigs of herbs hung to ward away evil. Fear of darkness was not folly here, it was the marrow of life. For when the sun died, the world became a different place. Roads vanished. Shapes moved where no shapes should be. The very air seemed alive with eyes unseen. Aldrich stretched out on the bed, drawing the blanket over him, though it smelled of smoke and old sweat. The straw crackled beneath his weight, pricking through the coarse linen like thorns. He placed the dagger by his hand and watched the candle burn, its small light waging a lonely war against the tide of black. Shadows crawled on the walls, long and crooked, and now and then the wind moaned through some crack in the timbers, a sound like a voice stretched thin with sorrow. Sleep came in fits, dragging him down only to cast him back upon the shoals of waking. Once, he thought he heard footsteps in the hall, a slow, dragging tread, too heavy for the tavern keeper's wife, too soft for boots. He held his breath and listened, but the sound faded like smoke in wind. Another time, he woke to find the candle nearly gone, its flame a mere pinprick trembling in a lake of molten fat. He rose and trimmed the wick with fingers clumsy from drowse, his heart thudding like a drum in his throat. For to let the candle die was unthinkable. Without it, the dark would come thick, absolute, a weight that crushed the soul at last. In the gray hush before dawn, Aldrich slept. When he woke, the light was thin and cold, leaking through the shutters like water through a cracked wall. The candle was nothing but a stump drowned in its own wax, and the room smelled of smoke and stale breath. He rose, stiff and hollow-eyed, and went down to find the tavern keeper banking the fire. For the day, the man looked up and gave a grunt, then thrust a chunk of bread into Aldrich's hand. "You lived," he said, not quite in jest. "Best keep to daylight, stranger. Night swallows men whole." Aldrich ate the bread as he walked, its hardness scraping his throat. The road lay pale before him, the frost glittering like powdered glass under the newborn sun. Behind him, the village crouched in its hollow, already shrinking into smoke and shadow. Ahead, the land rolled away in folds of gray and white, stitched with the black bones of trees. The world seemed almost kind in that cold light, almost clean. Yet he knew how swiftly that kindness died. He knew how quickly the dark would rise again, bringing its silence, its whispers, its endless hunger. And as he walked, he thought of the candle, the small, wavering flame that had held the night at bay. How fragile it was, how dear, a treasure of fat and fire, a single spark between man and madness. In that flicker lay all the frailty of life, and all its stubborn will to endure. The road wound like a serpent through the bare winter fields, and Aldrich walked with his cloak drawn tight, his breath rising in pale ghosts before his face. Behind him, the village was little more than a smear of smoke against the gray horizon, and ahead lay a spire black against the pallid sky, its bells tolling faint and hollow like the voice of a distant god. The sound stirred something in Aldrich's chest, a memory perhaps, or a warning. In these lands, the church was more than a house of prayer. It was a sentinel against the dark, a wall of stone and faith holding back the tide of night and all. It carried Dot when he reached the church. The bells had ceased, and the silence that followed was vast and grave. The doors stood open, their iron hinges screaming as the wind pressed against them. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of wax and old incense, heavy with the ghosts of countless prayers. Candles guttered in their sconces, their flames trembling like frightened souls. Above the altar, a crucifix hung, its figure bowed beneath the weight of suffering, its shadow long and crooked upon the wall. Aldrich removed his hood and bowed his head, though he was not sure to whom he bent God, or the fear that haunted him like a shadow since the first night he slept under a stranger's roof. For in this age, the night was not merely a span of hours. It was a realm, a dominion where sin and spirits ruled. The church taught this as truth. When the sun fell, the world belonged to temptation. The body grew weak, the mind wandered, and the devil, cunning as a wolf, slunk close to whisper his lies. Priests warned of it from their pulpits, their voices booming like thunder against the stone. Sleep, they said, was the sister of death, a door through which demons crept. To die in sleep without confession was to tumble headlong into damnation. And so men crossed themselves before lying down, whispering prayers like charms against the night. Aldrich remembered those prayers. "If I die before I wake, Lord, my soul, to thee I take." Words spoken in haste, almost by rote, yet heavy with fear. He remembered to the tales told by monks in cloisters, their faces pale as moonlight, stories of men who woke with claw marks on their flesh, of women strangled by unseen hands, of souls dragged screaming from their beds because they had failed to keep the vigil of virtue. For to dream of sin was sin enough, and the devil loved the bed more than the marketplace, for there the body lay slack and undefended, ripe for whispers. The priest appeared from the shadows like a wraith in black. He was an old man, his face furrowed like the bark of an oak, his eyes dark hollows that drank the light. He greeted Aldrich with a nod and led him to a bench near the altar. They spoke little at first, their voices hushed as if fearing to wake some sleeping thing in the rafters. When Aldrich at last asked of the night, the priest smiled a thin, mirthless smile. The night, he said, is God's test and the devil's snare. It is when men forget their prayers, when their thoughts wander to flesh and gold, when sloth wraps them like a cloak. Sin begins in darkness, and darkness begins with sleep. His voice was soft, yet it filled the nave like smoke, curling into the corners, clinging to the stone. That is why we bid them pray before the second sleep, why we teach them to wake in the deep hours and kneel upon the cold floor, whispering the psalms while the stars keep watch. For he who sleeps without prayer opens his soul like a door without a bar. Aldrich listened, and the memory of his nights returned the warmth of bodies pressed close, the weight of the blanket, the murmurs in the dark. He thought of how easily sin might slip between two breaths, how desire might stir in the hush between dreams. Perhaps that was why the church feared the bed, not only for its stillness, but for its heat, its secret music of flesh and sighs. How many sermons had thundered against the marriage bed, against the touch of hand to hand when it was not for begetting. How many lashes had been given for thoughts that bloomed in the soil of darkness, unseen by any eye but God's. The priest rose and fetched a candle, setting it upon the bench so its light fell upon his lined hands. "Keep this," he said, pressing the stub of wax into Aldrich's palm. "A candle is prayer made flesh. Its flame is faith. Its smoke the soul's breath. Let it burn as you sleep, and the dark will pass you by." Aldrich thanked him and left the church as the bells began to toll again, their sound rolling like waves across the fields. He walked on, the candle in his pack and the priest's words in his mind. That night, when he found a loft above a stable for his rest, he lit the candle and watched its flame tremble in the gloom. The straw smelled of horses and dung, the air thick with the heat of beasts. Yet he felt safer with that small, wavering light beside him. He lay down and whispered the prayer he had not spoken in years, his voice low and hoarse. "If I die before I wake." Sleep came slowly, winding about him like a serpent. Dreams rose dark, sweet, and heavy, but through them burned the candle's glow, a frail star in an endless sky. He woke once in the deep hours, the world silent but for the slow breath of horses. The candle had burned low, its wax pooling like blood on the board, its wick bowed like a weary pilgrim. He trimmed it, fed the flame, and lay back down, his heart steady now, his soul barred against the shadows. And as he drifted once more, he thought of the priest's words, of the bells that tolled like iron prayers, of the faith that clung like ivy to the crumbling wall of night. He thought of how men fought the dark with wax and whisper, with charms and chains of holy verse, and how, in the end, all their weapons were small as sparks against the tide. Yet still they fought, still they prayed, and perhaps that was enough. When dawn broke at last, pale and cold, Aldrich rose and quenched the stub of his candle. He shouldered his pack and stepped into the brittle light, the frost crunching under his boots. Behind him, the stable crouched in silence, its shadows shrinking before the day. Ahead lay the road, long and gray, curling like smoke toward the hills. He walked on, the wind sharp in his face, and in his heart a question he could not name, whether the night had truly passed, or whether it walked beside him still, silent and patient, waiting for the sun to fall again. Asterisk, asterisk, the sky was iron gray, stretched taut above the barren hills as Aldrich trudged along the rutted road. A thin wind licked at his cloak, carrying with it the smell of distant hearth smoke and something older, the scent of damp earth steeped in winter's silence. Behind him lay the last village, with its church bells fading like ghosts in the hollows of the land, and before him rose a line of black trees, their branches bare and clawing at the sky. Somewhere beyond them, he knew, lay shelter another hearth, another straw bed, another night. And with the night, the dreams. He had begun to fear them, though he would not confess it aloud. Dreams were no idle fancies here. They were doors, veils drawn back to show what waited beyond the reach of day. In the cloisters, he had heard monks speak of them with voices low as wind through crypts. How they were messages from heaven or whispers from hell, omens draped in shadow. To dream of fire was to call death to your door. To dream of running water was to summon change. To dream of the dead was to invite their cold fingers into your bed. These were not tales for children, they were truths etched deep into the marrow of life, truths no sane soul would scorn. That night, when Aldrich found lodging in a manor's hall, the weight of those truths settled like frost upon his bones. The hall was vast and dim, its beams black with the smoke of centuries. Shadows crouched in its corners, thick as wolves, and the fire in the hearth did little to tame them. The air smelled of roasting meat and damp rushes, of men and dogs, and iron. The Lord was away fighting, hunting. Who could say? But his steward offered a pallet near the embers, and Aldrich, too weary to refuse, sank upon it with a sigh. The murmur of voices faded. The hall emptied, and soon the world was nothing but darkness and the slow crackle of dying flames. Sleep took him like a thief, sudden and sure. And then the dream. He stood upon a road white with moonlight, a road that stretched to no horizon, hemmed by trees as black as ink. The wind moaned through their branches like the voice of the damned. At his feet lay a pool of water, still as glass, and in its depths he saw his own face pale, hollow-eyed, the skin drawn tight as parchment over bone. Then the water stirred, though no wind touched it, and another face rose from the depths. A woman's, fair and sorrowful, her eyes like bruises in the dark. Her lips moved, but no sound came, only a bloom of red in the water like a rose unfolding. Aldrich woke with a cry strangled in his throat, his heart pounding like a drum of war. The fire was ash, the hall a cavern of shadows. Round him, men snored, in drunken heaps, their breath loud and harsh. But to Aldrich it was the silence that screamed the silence, and the memory of that face, pale as moonlight, bleeding words he could not hear. He rose and paced the length of the hall, his bare feet whispering on the cold stone, until the first gray fingers of dawn crept through the shutters and loosened the grip of night. When the steward stirred, Aldrich asked him, careless as he could, what it meant to dream of water, of blood, of a woman's face. The man crossed himself at once and muttered a prayer. Bad, he said at last, his voice hushed. Bad as the gallows rope. Water runs to death, blood runs to doom. Best, light a candle at the church and give alms to the poor, lest the dream take flesh. Aldrich thanked him and walked on, the words coiling in his mind like smoke. Lest the dream take flesh. Could dreams do that, step from the shadowed realm of sleep and lay their hands upon the waking world? The priest in the last village would have said yes. The devil loved a dream as much as he loved a bed, for there the soul wandered naked and unguarded. He could shape its fancies, twist its visions, plant seeds of sin that would bloom by day. And what of God? Did he not also speak in dreams? Was Jacob's ladder not cast upon the dark of slumber? Did not Joseph read the riddle of Pharaoh's nights and save a nation from famine? The thought gave Aldrich no comfort. For who could tell which voice had spoken in his dream, the voice of heaven or the hiss of hell? He pondered it as he walked, as the day bled into dusk and the dusk into dark. When at last he reached another village, a huddle of wattle huts crouched beside a stream, the sky was a bowl of iron, and the first stars pricked its rim like nails. A woman gave him shelter in her cottage, a low, smoke-blackened den that smelled of sheep and onions. She fed him broth thin as mist and a crust of bread hard as oak, then spread a pallet by the hearth and bade him rest. But rest did not come. He lay in the red gloom of the fire's last glow, listening to the night press against the walls, and fear crawled like ants beneath his skin. For what if the dream returned? What if the face rose again from that dark water, her lips bleeding, words he could not hear? He crossed himself, whispered the prayer he had learned as a child, and at last, weary beyond fear, sank into slumber. And again dream. This time, the road was gone, the trees, the pool. He stood in a hall vast as the vault of heaven, its pillars lost in gloom, its floor a mirror of black glass. Candles burned in ranks without number, their flames tall and still, and in their light the air was thick with motes like drifting ash. At the far end rose a throne of stone, and upon it sat a figure cloaked in shadow. He could not see its face, yet he felt its eyes upon him, cold as iron, sharp as a knife's kiss. It raised its hand-to-hand pale as bone and beckoned. Aldrich tried to move, but his feet were roots sunk in the glass. The figure rose, its cloak billowing like smoke, and then he woke, choking on his own breath, his body slick with sweat, though the air was cold as a grave. The fire was dead, the room a tomb of darkness. The woman and her children lay curled like dogs in their bed, their breath rising in soft plumes. Aldrich sat with his head in his hands until the sky paled and the cocks began to crow, their cries harsh as laughter. At dawn, he left a coin on the hearth and fled. The road stretched gray before him, the wind keen as a blade, and in his heart a weight that no prayer could lift. For he knew now what he had only feared before. The dreams were not idle fancies, not shadows spun by sleep. They were doors, and something waited beyond them, something patient, something cold. And each night, the door swung wider. He walked on beneath a sky the color of lead, his breath a ragged ghost in the wind, and wondered if he would ever wake again, or if one night the dream would not end, and he would walk forever in that hall of black glass, beneath the gaze of ice he could not name. As the frost was thick on the ground when Aldrich left the village behind, its thatched roofs crouched like old men huddled against the cold. The sky was a pale shroud stretched taut across the earth, and the air bit like iron at his cheeks. He walked with his cloak drawn close, boots crunching on the frozen mud, his breath rising in small gray clouds. For hours, he saw no soul upon the road, only the black stubble of fields and the occasional tree, its branches bare as bone. Yet in his mind, the voices of last night still murmured, the voices that had spoken by the fire of strange things, of the watch and the second. Sleep? He had heard the words before, in passing, but had never thought much of them. Sleep was sleep, or so he had believed. A man lay down when he was weary, rose when the sun called him, and that was the sum of it. But not so here. In these cold lands where darkness ruled half the day, and fear wove its threads through every hour, the peasants spoke of the night as if it were tonight, cut by a blade of waking in the deep hours. A stillness where thoughts prowled like wolves and sins came stalking. And as Aldrich listened, he felt the weight of old beliefs pressing close, like the hush of snow before a storm. When dusk fell, and the bells tolled their iron warning, Aldrich found lodging in a cottage that crouched low against the wind, its roof sagging under years of smoke and frost. The woman who welcomed him was gray as winter. Her hands knotted like roots, her back bent beneath the yoke of toil. She gave him a stool by the hearth and a bowl of broth thin as mist, then spread a pallet near the fire when the hour grew late. The room was small and close, the air heavy with the mingled scents of wood smoke, wool, and the sharp tang of onions. Shadows crawled like black vines across the beams, and the only light came from the fire, its glow painting the walls in restless red. They prayed before lying down, their voices low, their words a chain against the dark. Aldrich whispered with them, though the old prayers felt strange on his tongue. Then the cottage sank into silence, broken only by the slow breath of sleepers and the hiss of logs settling in the embers. Aldrich drew his cloak about him and closed his eyes, surrendering to the pull of weariness. Sleep came swift and deep, a plunge into black water, but it did not last. Some hours later he knew not how many Aldrich woke. Not fully, not at first. He drifted on the edge of dreams, hearing sounds that were not sounds. The soft creak of rafters, the sigh of wind at the shutter, the faint murmur of a child turning in its sleep. The fire had guttered low, its light a mere blush among the ashes. For a moment, panic brushed his skin, sharp as a knife's kiss, and he groped for his dagger in the dark. Then he stilled, for nothing stirred save the slow, patient rhythm of breath dot, and yet the house was not dead. In the far corner, the old woman was awake. He saw her by the glow of the embers, a hunched shape on the bench, her hands busy with some task mending, perhaps, or spinning flax. Her lips moved, whispering words he could not catch. And now, and then she glanced at the door as if fearing what might press its face against the wood. Aldrich lay watching, the heaviness of sleep fallen from him like a cloak. And in the stillness, he felt something strange, a sense that the night itself had shifted, grown thinner, as if the veil between worlds had worn to a thread. Asterisk after a time, the old woman rose and crossed herself. She stirred the fire, coaxing it to a sullen glow, then set a pot of water to warm. The smell of herbs soon curled through the room, sharp, clean, and bitter. She drank in silence, her hands kept around the steaming bowl, and when Aldrich stirred at last and asked what she did, she only smiled, her teeth pale as bone in the ember light. "It is the watch," she said, her voice low as falling snow. "The hour for prayers and thoughts and things that walk in dreams. No man should sleep the whole night through. That is when sin creeps in." Aldrich frowned, and she laughed softly, the sound like the crackle of frost. "You are not of this place," she said, "or you would know. We sleep in twain. First sleep for the body, second for the soul. Between them, the mind wakes, and in that waking, all truths come clear." He asked her what truths, but she only shrugged and sipped her bitter brew. Outside, the wind muttered along the eaves like an old man talking in his sleep. Aldrich lay back, staring at the beams lost in shadow, and wondered at her words. First sleep, second sleep. It was a strange thing, yet it felt true. Had he not woken as if summoned, as if some old law of flesh and spirit had tugged him from the depths? Had he not felt the hush like a weight upon his chest, the sense of something near, something waiting? When the second sleep came, it was softer, slower, like sinking into deep moss. He dreamed of nothing, or nothing he could recall, and when dawn broke pale and cold, the night seemed a far-off shore, glimpsed through mist. Yet as he walked on, leaving the cottage crouched in its hollow, the thought clung to him like a burr to sleeps, with a gulf between, a gulf filled with whispers and prayers, with sins confessed in the dark, with secrets spoken to no ear but Gods, he thought of what men might do in that hush, when the world lay still as a tomb, and the fire's glow was the only sun. Lovers stealing to each other's arms, their breath quick in the shadows. Old men counting their sins on a string of beads. Wives nursing babes at breasts pale as wax, their faces carved with weariness and grace. And others, to those who dealt in darker arts, who set their snares of spell and charm while the moon peered like a blind eye through the frost. Perhaps that was why the church spoke so often at the midnight hour, why its bells tolled not for sleep but for prayer. The devil loves the dark, the priests had said, and darkness is deepest when the stars burn cold. Best to meet him waking than in dreams, with the tongue armed by psalm and the hand by sign of the cross. And so they broke the night into a wall of waking set between the floods of sleep. A watch kept not with sword and shield, but with whispered words and trembling light. As Aldrich walked beneath a sky white with cloud, he pondered all this: the broken night, the long hours steeped in silence, the secret life that bloomed like a pale flower in the dark. Perhaps men were not made for one long oblivion, but for a tide that ebbed and flowed, carrying them from flesh to spirit and back again. Perhaps the soul needed its vigil as the body needed its rest. Or perhaps it was only fear that shaped the custom, the fear of what might creep through a door left unbarred, through a mind left undefended. Fear. And the endless hunger for meaning in a world where death walked close as a shadow, and tomorrow was a coin no man could spend twice. He walked on, the wind sharp in his face. And as dusk gathered like smoke in the hollows, he felt again that old unease, the sense that night was not a thing to be slept through, but a sea to be crossed with care, its deeps sown with wreck and wonder. And when at last he found shelter beneath a sagging roof and lay upon a bed of straw, he did not fight the waking when it came. He rose in the hush, stirred the embers, and sat with his thoughts as the hours dripped like melting ice. For now, he knew, the night was not one thing but two, and between them lay a road as long and strange as any he had walked by day. Asterisk, the first gray light bled across the eastern rim of the sky like milk spilled on slate. Aldrich stood on the crest of a hill, his breath smoking in the iron air, and watched the night loosen its grip on the world. Behind him lay miles of frost-bound road, stitched with the dark threads of hedgerows and broken fences. Ahead, the land, unfurled in pale silence, fields silvered with hoarfrost, streams glazed like mirrors, woods black and still as sleeping beasts. Above it all, the heavens blushed faintly, the stars paling like dying embers as the sun, slow and solemn, began its climb. That dawn was no common art in these lands. It was a benediction, a reprieve, a blade of light severing the throat of darkness. Men feared the night with a fear they seldom spoke, yet it seeped into every prayer, every nail driven into a door, every candle stub saved like treasure. For the night was not empty. It was a country ruled by silence and shadow, by things that walked without name. To live till morning was no small triumph. It was deliverance, bought with wax and whispered psalms, with beads worn smooth by fingers clenched in dread. Aldrich had learned this truth as the road unwound beneath his weary boots, as cottage after cottage opened its low doors to him, as hearth after hearth cast its sullen glow upon his face. He had seen the customs men kept against the dark, the herbs hung in smoky rafters, the charms scratched on lintels, the iron knives laid across cradles like swords. He had watched them kneel when the last bell tolled, their voices frayed with fear, had heard them murmur prayers like chains while the wind prowled at the shutters. And always, when the dawn came, he had seen their shoulders ease, their faces soften, their eyes flare with the shy joy of reprieve. Now, as the first spears of sunlight pierced the gloom, Aldrich felt that joy stir in him, faint and strange, like warmth stealing through ice. He drew his cloak close and began the descent, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, the wind sharp as a whetted blade at his cheek. A village crouched in the hollow below, its roofs puffing thin threads of smoke, its fields shorn and stark. From the church tower rose a single bell, slow and solemn, calling the sleepers to praise. Its voice rolled across the frost like the tolling of iron hope, and with each peal the shadows fled a little farther, beaten back by the march of day. The road curved between hedgerows black with thorns, past ricks of hay hooded in white, past trees whose limbs were crusted with glittering frost. A dog barked from a yard, its voice harsh in the brittle air, and a cock crowed, shrill as a trumpet. Windows blinked awake one by one, yellow squares of fire winking through the gray, and doors creaked open to spill the smell of smoke and baking bread. Men trudged to the byre with forks and pails, their breath pluming like banners. Women stooped at wells crusted with ice, children scampered with shrill cries, their feet scattering rime like broken glass. The world, so lately a tomb, stirred and breathed again, and Aldrich felt as if he too had been hauled from grave to light. He paused at the edge of the green, where the frost lay thick as spilled salt, and watched the bells' summons draw the folk in slow streams to the church. They came muffled in cloaks and hoods, their boots clogging with clods of frozen earth, their faces pale as wax in the cold. Some bore candles stubbed and guttered, relics of the night's long watch. Others fingered beads or clutched sprigs of withered herbs. All crossed themselves as they passed the light gate, their eyes lifting to the tower with a hunger that was more than hunger for warmth. For the Mass at dawn was no mere rite, it was a thanksgiving, a covenant renewed, a shield raised anew against the dark that would fall again. Aldrich followed them, his steps slow, his heart strangely full. The church loomed squat and gray against the paling sky, its stones crusted with frost, its roof sagging under years of snow and rain. The doors stood wide, spilling a wash of gold upon the frozen ground, and as Aldrich crossed its threshold, the hush within folded round him like a cloak. Candles flared in the nave, their flames tall and still, casting long spires of shadow that trembled on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of wax and smoke, of damp wool and weary breath, of something older still, the smell of stone steeped in centuries of prayer. He knelt among them, these folk of earth and frost, and felt the weight of their voices rise like a tide, low and slow and solemn. Gloria in excelsis Deo. The words rolled like thunder beneath the vault, broke like waves upon the altar steps, and soared to die among the rafters black with smoke. Aldrich led them wash through him, their cadence beating time with the slow pulse of his blood, and for a little while the weariness slipped from his bones, the dread from his heart. For in that mingled murmur, that trembling light, there was something stronger than fear, stronger even than the dark. There was faith not in the sense of painted saints or gilded shrines, but in the stubborn will of men to endure, to wrest some shred of meaning from the maw of night, to kindle their small, wavering candles against the wind and believe they were stars. When the Mass ended, the folk filed out in silence, their faces grave yet kindled with a fire that was not wholly of the hearth. Aldrich lingered a moment, his eyes upon the crucifix that hung above the altar. Its figure bowed beneath a weight no dawn could lighten. Then he rose and followed them into the day. The sun had climbed a little higher, burning pale through veils of mist, and the frost flashed like a sea of glass. Smoke curled from chimneys. Bells chimed like silver coins spilled on stone, and the air rang with the clang of pails. The bark of dogs, the shrill cries of children loosed like birds from cages. Life moved again, clumsy and stubborn. upon the face of the earth. Yet Aldrich knew how thin the life was, how frail its walls, how close the dark crouched beyond the rim of light. He knew that when the sun fell and the bells tolled the curfew, the old fear would stir again, coiling like smoke in the hollows of the heart. And perhaps that was why the dawn seemed so dear, because it was lent, not given, and each day was a coin snatched from the claw of night. He turned his face to the road, his shadow long upon the whitening earth, and walked on. Behind him, the bells tolled once more, bright as iron on the wind, and before him the sky widened, pale and cold and endless. Yet in his breast, where fear had coiled like a serpent, something else now stirred, something small and stubborn, as a spark cupped in hollowed hands. Hope, perhaps, or only the will to go on, to keep walking through the waste of frost and shadow, to light what candles he could and let them burn, though the night was deep and the wind was strong. And so, our journey through the strange and fascinating sleep habits of the medieval world comes to an end. From shared straw beds to ghostly midnight visions, these stories remind us how life in the Middle Ages was both simple and mysterious. Thank you for staying with us until the very last chapter. Your curiosity keeps history alive. If you enjoyed this tale, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story from the past. And as always, don't forget to write your favorite Shalawat in the comments below, because sharing blessings makes the world a little brighter. Sweet dreams, and see you in the next story.